All right, we're good. Hello, good evening. Welcome to another episode of the Rain Race Podcast. I forget the episode number that we're on, but I'm Chris Aurelio, and I'm joined alongside, as always, by Kyle Cuthbertson.
What's up?
We have plenty of stuff to talk about in this episode, just based on the fact that there were 3 races that we're going to recap from this weekend. Actually, 4, 2 IndyCar races, and we have a boatload of news that has come out all the way up until this morning that we're going to recap towards the end of the episode. Couple things before we get to that. Obviously, this podcast is supposed to be Monday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern. Just had to delay it to Tuesday again. I think we're getting pretty frequent with these delays, just because of some late schedule switch-ups. But if you want to check out the updates on when we're going to be posting an episode, you can follow us on Twitter. That's at Rain Race Podcast. It's on the screen if you're watching on YouTube. Also, I made a Discord server with some Rain Race Podcast and channel notifications in there as well. So if you want to get in on that, the link is available on my YouTube channel in the banner. That's youtube.com/c/GTRain. You can check out that Discord and get notifications on when we're posting an episode. Also, I want to say a big thank you to the roughly 1,400 people that are new from the last episode, 1,400 people that have subscribed to my YouTube channel. Since we did the last episode a couple of weeks ago, I put out a new video that seems to have been doing really well over the past couple of days/week or so, and hopefully the channel is only going to continue to grow from here. I have plenty more videos planned for the summer, so stick around, and I'm going to be much more frequent with the uploads as well as we get into the summer months and I'm not preoccupied with school. So I want to start things off today by talking about the FIA World Endurance Championship race. That is the title of the podcast of this episode. Also, one more thing I do want to mention before we get into that is if you're new here, this is a live podcast, which is pretty uncommon, I think, overall in the podcasting world. So you can leave your comments in the YouTube chat, and we will try to answer as many of those as we possibly can throughout this episode. But I do want to talk about the FIA World Endurance Championship race. Most notably, the biggest thing with this race is that it was the first race for the Hypercar category. Sorry, lost my train of thought there for a second. The Toyota GR010 was, I'm going to say, the only new car that we saw in the Hypercar category for this race. And the Alpine A480 is basically just a rebadged Rebellion with an Alpine livery on it. Now, at the next race at Portimao, we are expecting to see the Glickenhaus 007 car on the grid there at Le Mans as well. So we're going to have to see what their schedule looks like post Le Mans. I know that that's still a little bit up in the air. So overall, first impressions with the Hypercar category. Kyle, I'm not sure how much of the race you actually tuned into.
I didn't see any of it.
Okay. Off to a great start. But a couple of things that I want to point out with the Hypercar category that are definitely different from LMP1. I made a video last July called Why LMP1 Cars Lift and Coast. It's actually the most popular video I have on this channel. Now, if you had paid attention to any of the onboards from this weekend in the Le Mans Hypercar class, notably the Toyota, because I mentioned in that video that the non-hybrid cars didn't utilize that technique. If you paid attention to the Toyota, you'll notice that they're not doing that anymore. That was all part of energy allocation based on what hybrid subclass that they were in. If you paid attention to an onboard, especially from qualifying, I think it's noticeable. Maybe there's a little bit of lifting and coasting for saving the brakes potentially. The cars are a little bit heavier, but certainly not for the same reason that they were previously. Now, on the topic of braking, I did notice quite a couple of times throughout the race that Toyota, in particular, ran into some issues with locking up. Now, these cars are quite a bit heavier than the LMP1 cars that were running before it. I wish I had written down a specific number as to how much the TS050 weighed. Let's see if I can do some quick Googling on this one. looks like in the beginning of 2020, the TS050 had a minimum weight of 895 kilograms, and I believe it is a little bit over 1,000 for the GR010. Let's see if I can get a number on that for you. Let's see, weight, yeah, 1040 kilograms. I think it was actually knocked down to 1030 for the race. Don't quote me on that though. So yeah, heavier car than the drivers are used to from Toyota, and I noticed that there were some lockups happening. Sure that as the drivers get more used to this new formula of cars, we're going to see less of that, but certainly something that was worth noting, and especially in the case of the number 7 Toyota, Kamui Kobayashi, locked up from the lead with about a little bit less than 2 hours to go, and that actually cost them the race because they got stuck in the sand and in the gravel and had to get lifted out via the crane. So, something worth noting for Le Mans. Certainly, I don't think, brake fade is going to be a concern. They're still using those carbon ceramic brakes, but at Le Mans, I would be curious, especially looking into the Mulsanne chicanes, to see if that's going to become an issue for the drivers. Just a little bit, though, as they get used to the new formula of cars. All 3 of the cars are heavier than the LMP1 predecessors that came before it. Now, LMP2, and one big thing I want to talk about here is a huge talking point going into the race and going into the weekend as a whole, is that LMP2 cars were actually a little bit quicker than the hypercars. And we saw this at the WEC Prologue, which took place at Spa 1 week before the race weekend. And I think that raised some red flags. I was certainly like, I don't see how the hypercars are not sandbagging, considering the Alpine is lighter and more powerful than the LMP2 cars. So, maybe the Toyota would be a little bit of a question mark, but the Alpine I certainly expected would have been quicker. So I suspected a little bit of sandbagging was at play there. In the end, when it came to qualifying in the race, the hypercars were a little bit quicker. Certainly nowhere near the level that they were previously in terms of the gap between LMP1 and LMP2 cars. Now, this sort of created a whole finger pointing game as to what should happen. Should we speed up the hypercars? Should we slow down the LMP2 cars more? Now, obviously the LMP2 class, the way that they made those cars slower is primarily by adding more weight to the cars. The hypercars, as I mentioned, are much heavier than the LMP1 cars. Therefore, the easiest way to slow down the LMP2 cars is just to add more weight to those cars. Now, you got to remember, at the end of the day, LMP2 is a Pro-Am class, which means you need to have professional and amateur drivers on the lineup. And some drivers especially were saying that the cars were much more difficult to drive just because of how much heavier they were than last season. So adding weight to the LMP2 cars, I don't think that that's really the smartest option. In fact, I'm glad that there were no BOP updates before the race. I'm glad that it kind of just stayed the way it was. Other things that we noticed is that the LMP2 cars were actually quicker around the corners. I think Sector 2 was pretty much the LMP2 strong suit at Spa compared to the Hypercars, where Sector 1 and 2, the Hypercars had a little bit of a speed advantage because it is faster in a straight line. JT 33396 says as long as LMP2 is slower at Le Mans. Yeah, that was going to be my second, or I guess my next talking point, was at Le Mans I'd expected that deficit's going to be significantly greater because Le Mans is a very speed-heavy track, and the difference in top speed between the Hypercars and the LMP2 cars is still quite significant. So perhaps in the Porsche curves, if they don't make any changes from where they are right now, then the LMP2 cars might have a little bit of an advantage. So you might see the LMP2 cars actually being caught up behind the Hypercars a little bit, again, if no changes are made from where we are currently. But I would expect at Le Mans, even with no changes from where we are right now, that it would still be a Hypercar-dominated time chart, basically. Now, other races after that, that's where you start to run into some questions. Spa is, as I said, a pretty high-speed, heavy track as is. So once you get into some of those other tracks like Portimao, maybe then you'd see the LMP2 cars a little bit quicker. So I personally hope that the hypercars end up getting a speed advantage. And Kyle, I do want to give you a chance to talk here because I'm running myself out of breath.
Not much to say. I didn't see it.
Well, I know, but I'm just saying, on the topic of hypercars, they're running with, I think, way more ballast than they need to be right now. And it's slowing them down in these corner sections.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure you're sitting in the same boat as me, where it makes more sense to speed up the hypercars than it does to slow down the LMP2 cars even more.
Yeah.
Okay. Great discussion there.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I wanted to talk about, sort of to boost my my theory here, not really a theory because it's already known that the hypercars are faster in a straight line, is the event maximum speeds from each of the cars at Spa. Toyota had the two fastest cars in a straight line, both clocking in at exactly 312.3 kilometers per hour. In miles per hour, just quick conversion, that's a little bit under 200. I want to say it's around the 195 mile an hour range, somewhere around there. The Alpine was just 1 kilometer per hour slower than that at 311.4. And the fastest LMP2 car was 305.2 kilometers per hour. So still a little bit of a difference in the top speed between the cars, as I had mentioned. The other thing worth noting is that the hypercars are actually quicker in a straight line than the LMP1 hybrids that came before it, because, as I had mentioned in my Toyota GR010 video, the LMP1 hybrids actually had half of their power essentially cut out after I don't know a specific mile per hour. It kind of varied, but certainly once they got towards their top end, they were only running with the internal combustion engine power, which was around 500 horsepower rather than the combined 1,000. Let's see. We got another chat here. Isn't the reason the hypercars are slower than LMP1 is because Aston Martin wanted it, and then they decided to bin the idea? So loosely, yes, because Aston Martin was the manufacturer that was heavily suggesting, hey, can we do a road car based hypercar class? So that way they could enter the Aston Martin Valkyrie. And the ACO and the FIA said, yeah, sure, we're going to allow that. You have a road car based hypercar now that's going to be significantly heavier than a purpose-built prototype. And as a result, they had to raise the minimum weight of the cars. And we all know what happened after that. Aston Martin sort of pulled their entry. And as I mentioned at the end of my last video, it looks like that entry is dead in the water right now, which is a big shame because I, for one, wanted that Cosworth V12 at Le Mans. Let's see. We also said Portimao stratification is certainly still a question. What do you mean by stratification? I'm a little bit interested to see what you're referencing by that. I think that the goal was always to make them slower, but Aston Martin requiring them didn't help it. Yeah, so here's just replying to a previous comment that I just talked about. Let's just go over the results from the WEC race. I'm just going to go over the top three from each class. Obviously, Hypercar, only 3 cars, so the Toyota number 8 won the race. Sebastian Buemi, Kazuki Nakajima, and Brendan Hartley. Number 36 Alpine finished second, and the number 7 Toyota finished third. In LMP2, it was the 22 United Autosports entry that won. Fully Orica-based class. Actually, there was one LMP2 car, the number 44, that was a Ligier entry, but United Autosports switching from Ligier to Orica, actually looking like they're an extremely strong team this season. So I'd say they're definitely a team to look at for Le Mans, potentially walking out on top. GTE Pro, we had Corvette Racing make an appearance. They're going to be at Portimao as well. Unfortunately, it was Oliver Gavin's final race at Spa. Great shame to see him leaving the sports car racing scene. I'm sure that a lot of people would have loved to have seen him continue on a little bit more, but he is going to be retiring from driving competitively. He's formed the Oliver Gavin Driving Academy, and So that was his final race in a Corvette. Would have loved to have seen him end up on the podium, but unfortunately it was a fourth place result for that number 63 Corvette. Top three in the race were the 92 Porsche, 51 AF Corsa Ferrari, and the 52 AF Corsa Ferrari. And finally in GTE-AM, it was the 83 AF Corsa Ferrari, winning the GTE-AM class, the 33 TF Sport Aston Martin, and the 47 Cheddalar Racing Ferrari rounding out the podium. A couple other things rolling in here as I was going over these results. Portimao doesn't have anything equivalent to Spa Sector 1, where the hypercars can just pull away. Yeah, so that's sort of going off what I was saying earlier, where I'm really curious to see what they're going to do post Le Mans. I think right now they can keep what they have for Le Mans in terms of the balance between the hypercar class and LMP2, but Portimao is going to be a big question. So post Le Mans, I'm really interested to see in what they do. I hope they speed the hypercars up. Stratification is the FIA and ACO's new term for keep the different classes away from each other. Oh, okay. So there you go. So yeah, going back to the original comment, Portimao stratification is certainly still a question. Yeah. Sort of just been a theme that I've been touching on here a little bit. We're going to have to see what they decide to do for that one. I don't think I have all that much to go over for the rest of Spa. I do want to give myself a break from talking because I think I'm on like, I don't know how many minutes straight, almost 16 minutes straight of talking. And so I think it's time for me to turn the tables over to Kyle. We had 2 IndyCar races at Texas this weekend, Kyle. And unfortunately, I was working through both of them, so I was only able to catch a little bit of each race. So I'm going to give you the reins on this one, starting out with the recap of the Genesis 300, the first race at Texas. Why don't you take it away from me here?
Oh, man, wasn't the Genesis 300 such a brilliant, fantastic race? Oh, my gosh. I love 2 races at Texas. It's great, isn't it? Especially when the track has the PJ1 on both the top grooves that makes the racing one groove and impossible to pass. Yeah, I love it. Especially when there's double headers and you get to see the same boring race twice. Well, that's not exactly what happened. The second race is a little bit better, but first the Genesis 300. It somehow got worse early in the day because the first practice was rained out or delayed because they did get one practice in, but it had to be that came at the cost of qualifying because it was pushed back so far that qualifying was canceled and the grid was set by points, which kind of just, when you have Scott Dixon starting up front at Texas, you can kind of see where that's going to go. Tony Kanaan was actually fastest in the practice session. Looked like he had a lot of speed, but obviously this being his first race of the season meant he had to start in dead last, which meant pretty much any hopes of winning was pretty much off the table. We did have some interesting things happen during this race. We had, I also, it's important to mention that Chris was at work, so we only got to see the end of it. And I was actually only able to see the last 40 laps, but I did go through and rewatch highlights. So there are some things throughout the race that I'm a little bit not sure how. But I do know that there were 2 accidents during this race. One where Joseph Newgarden pretty much turned Sebastian Bourdais. Chris, did you see that?
I did. I watched, you know what? We'd like to knock on IndyCar's media here a little bit, but one thing I'll give IndyCar media is that they do a great job with those fast forward things where I can watch the entire, I mean, not that I'd want to go back and watch the entire Texas race anyway, so being able to see the whole, get a decent grip of what happened over the race in 30 minutes is pretty helpful. So yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, that was weird. I've never seen someone pretty much basically wreck someone NASCAR style in an IndyCar. Obviously, Joseph Newgarden didn't do it on purpose, but it's just Texas, basically with it being one lane, you pretty much have enough room for 2 cars on the inside. And if 2 cars check up in front of you and you check up all you can, you're going to turn someone.
Well, so Bourdais was slowing down for, was it Colton Herta he was slowing down for? Okay.
Yeah. If you watch Newgarden's onboard, he was like off the throttle. To visualize this, he was off the throttle throughout the entirety of 1 through the middle. Maybe just got on the throttle like maybe like 10%, and then ended up just turning Bourdais, and it was one of the weirdest things I've ever witnessed. That happened, as well as Hinchcliffe getting he got so last year. This was actually pretty interesting, but it was pretty ironic. So last year's Texas IndyCar race in the spring uh, ended with Felix Rosenquist, who was trying to catch Dixon to take the win, and it looked like he was going to. It ended with him making a pass on James Hinchcliffe and then getting into the PJ1 and spinning and wrecking. Well, in this race, the second yellow was Felix Rosenquist once again passing Hinchcliffe and taking the air off of Hinchcliffe, and this time it was Hinchcliffe who hit the wall. So the Genesis car had a terrible end to the Genesis 300. That was a shame. But in the end of the day, it was Scott Dixon who won the race pretty easily. But that wasn't the story. The big story was second place. It was Scott McLaughlin who scored his first ever podium in IndyCar. And what I've yet to figure out, and I've like watched, he started 15th, and I don't think he got there because of strategy. I think McLaughlin just got up to second, man. And he if you watch the final 40 laps, he was actually catching Scott Dixon. There was a point in time where he'd be 5/10 back, get back to 2/10, and then it just dropped right back because Texas is terrible and you can't pass. So I mean, he was catching Dixon, but if you were able to pass at Texas, maybe he would have had something. But yeah, nonetheless, Scott McLaughlin, second place. That put him up to 7th in the points, which was incredible, I thought. But the only other notable thing that happened was at the end of the race, Colton Herta, right at the very end, had some sort of brake issue on the right rear, which had him DNF the race, which not good for the points. Colton Herta is a guy that we're really looking that could be a championship contender. If you just look at trying to find results.
I got the results for you if you want them. What are you looking for?
I was just going to go over obviously Scott Dixon won, Scott McLaughlin in second. Pato Award finished third, Alex Palou in fourth. Graham Rahal finished fifth. Newgarden sixth, Harvey seventh, Rossi eighth, Sato ninth, and Pagenaud in 10th, rounding up the top 10. The Rahal guys, they looked quick. Graham Rahal actually started in points. He was like 13th, somewhere in the back. Rossi, obviously finishing 8th from being as far back in the points as he was, not bad. Texas is a huge track position track. So wherever you start, if you're starting in the back, then a top 10 finish is not too shabby. So yeah, that's pretty much everything from race number 1.
Okay, but before you move on to race 2, I do want to say, not to make this podcast, I know it kind of sounds like the Scott McLaughlin fan club a little bit, some of these episodes, but one of the things I mentioned in the IndyCar preview episode was, or maybe it was an episode before that I have a lot of faith in Scott McLaughlin's confidence when it comes to anything that he drives. And for a rookie, for his first IndyCar race on an oval, I think second place was just extremely impressive. One of the drivers I look back to is Alexander Rossi. His first oval was 2016 at Phoenix. And I remember him saying that, I'm a little bit skeptical of this whole oval thing. And that was, at Phoenix they were going considerably slower than they were at Texas. Texas is a super speedway, sort of small wing style IndyCar racetrack. And for Scott McLaughlin to get up to speed that quickly, I think that's a huge boost to his confidence for the month of May, which, hey, by the way, check the date. And also, just really impressed me as a spectator to see him get up to oval racing that quickly. I think that a lot of people were thinking, maybe he's going to do all right at some of the road courses, and then the ovals are going to be a learning experience this year. Seems like quite the opposite. It seems like at the oval races, he's already ready to pack some punches and potentially find himself a winner for the final 2 oval races of the season. We'll just have to wait and see on that one. But you can continue on with your recap on race 2 before I jump back to some other things I want to talk about with this race weekend.
Well, race two was about 30 something laps longer, which made it more of a strategical race. If you were making, because you had to make 3 stops rather than 2. But the green flag of this race. So we're going into day number 2, and we think it's going to be the once again we're ready to sit here and be bored. Well, right off the green flag, one car gets into another car, who then closes the door on another car, which sends that car airborne and on its lid until it hits the grass, flips back over. Connor Daly ended up catapulting off of the left front of Ed Jones. I don't even remember who he got smacked by, but so basically at the start, Pietro Fittipaldi tries to get a good jump on the start. Once again, Sebastian Bourdais gets ran into the back of, and then that sends Bourdais into Rossi, which collects Ed Jones. Who was the other one? Oh, TK got into it too, but he was up against the wall. But Daly ended up going over Ed Jones and ending up on his roof. He was okay. Definitely one of those accidents that there's a lot of people who saw that accident. The large majority said they were, hey, that would have been a lot scarier without the aero screen. So aero screen once again, great job. But then you had that, you have those people who were just like, they didn't really, they're still not believers of the aero screen and still just think he would have been fine. But yeah, I definitely saw that as an accident. When you see a car up in the air, cockpit kind of towards the wall, yeah, I'm definitely glad that aero screen's there. There's definitely still people who don't believe in the aero screen, but yeah, I definitely just feel more comfortable with it there. I think it definitely did a great job. First flip like that I think we've seen since the aero screen, which is why you get all those people who just instantly chime in. But nonetheless, right off the bat, we get a flip right off the bat. That sends like 6 cars home. And then as the race went on, after it got green once again, we thought it was just back to Texas, back to just watching cars in a single file line, just chilling. And then we got, oh man, there was a second yellow. I watched this race live. You know what's
It
funny?
was for
When I watch races live, I retain things that happened like worse than when I watch the highlights. This is upsetting.
well, I know there's a yellow for Rosenquist losing a wheel, but I don't know if that was towards the end of the race.
Yeah, there were a couple yellow. There was a couple. Dixon said it best in the middle of the race. This is a weird race. Definitely just weird. Chris, you have any thoughts while I find?
Well, okay, so while you do that, I just want to say what a poor, very disappointing weekend for Sebastian Bourdais. As you'd mentioned, out first caution on not lap one, on the first race, taken out by Joseph Newgarden. Second race doesn't even make it to the start finish line before he's retired. And that's a driver that was sitting, I believe he was 5th in the points before Texas after the first 2 races of the season. So definitely a real heartbreak for him in the AJ4 team. I want to see where he was sitting in points now. I think it was all the way down in 14th. Yeah, 14th right now for Sebastian Bourdais. And as I said, I believe that team was 5th after Barber and St. Petersburg. So real shame for that team. Real disappointment for Sebastian Bourdais. But hopefully he can find some traction going into the month of May. Gam Wolfers said race 2 is the longest race, 1.5 mile track race in history. There's pretty. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to. There's pretty something to look at for the Indy 500. So I'm just going to try. I assume you're saying distance-wise, it was the longest 1.5 mile race that IndyCar has done. And it's something to look at for the Indy 500, which is in just a couple of weeks from now. Yeah, that's also something I wanted to get into. But Kyle, did you find what you were looking for before we do that?
Yeah, I do remember now that the first yellow was for Jack Harvey. Obviously, it was second yellow, but
Right.
the yellow for Jack Harvey. At first, I thought he was blowing an engine, but he actually had the same issue as Colton Herta did with the brake rotor. But it definitely looked a lot more like a blown engine, which caused for a yellow. And that came out around lap 120. So when that came out, all of the leaders pit, which for a three-stop strategy when you have a 248 lap race. So pitting on lap 120, that sets you up with maybe having one stop to the end. That's definitely early on your window. So basically what we got for the next stint was, instead of Dixon just being able to run away, Dixon wasn't able to make the fuel number while being in clean air. So basically what you had guys not wanting the lead. So Rahal took the lead for a little bit, realized he couldn't make the number, so he gave it back to Dixon, and they just kind of rode around, and it was just a long period of time of just who's going to blink first and pit. And then so we get to the final stop. I think Dixon and Rahal pit first. I think Award pit a lap later. But as these pit sequences are happening for the supposedly final time, Felix Rosenquist loses a tire coming off of pit road, and that brings out a yellow right after the leaders have pitted. But what that did, basically the most important thing that did, was Joseph Newgarden was on pit lane right as that happened, which basically would give him the race lead. There were some guys who stayed out who actually pit early, like Sato and Ericsson and Hunter Ray, who pit like 20 laps earlier just to get the undercut, because like I said, everyone up front was saving fuel. So the guys who undercut were running like 20 mile per hour faster, 15. They were running way faster. So they were something to look for. And as that yellow happened, obviously they got kind of screwed because they had to stay out and run like 20 laps up front and then pit, which basically just screwed them even further. But I mean, hey, but basically Newgarden got lucky, ended up being the first car out of the guys who pitted. And then on the restart, it was basically just a matter of time before Pato O'Ward passed Newgarden and ran off with the race win. Because throughout the race, I had said Pato O'Ward probably had the strongest car because he was battling up there with Will Power, Scott Dixon. He was basically up front the whole time. It was just, it's so hard to pass here that there's no way, if you have the best car, you really have to get lucky with your runs. So the best car, I think, won. Rahal was really strong. Dixon ended up finishing in I just lost the result there. Dixon actually finished in fourth. He did get passed by Rahal, which they actually had to go on a fuel save like run in the last like 10 laps, which is something interesting. So let's go over the top 10 real quick. Pato O'Ward, Joseph Newgarden, Graham Rahal in third, Dixon in fourth, Herta in fifth, Pagenaud in sixth, Palou in seventh, McLaughlin in eighth, another top 10, VK in ninth, and Hunter Ray in 10th. So yeah, I mean the Chevys going into the month of May for the 500 look like they have better fuel, which is something to note. Newgarden got lucky, and McLaughlin with another top 10, and Will Power had two less than optimal days. He was actually running in the top 5 before he got put into the PJ1. We love Texas. Jack Harvey started fifth, was fifth in the points, blown rotor, like we said. Sucks for him. Also, in the lap 1 incident, the coming to the green incident, should say, James Hinchcliffe got some damage, and he had to DNF for mechanical. So those are 2 days straight of just terrible results for Hinchcliffe. And overall, I think that pretty much wraps it up for IndyCar this weekend, or what I got.
Okay, so there's a couple things I want to talk about here. Number one, we mentioned the PJ1, we mentioned Texas, the track itself just being subpar. I want to get into that a little bit because there's been sort of an argument this week as to whether Texas should remain on the schedule for future seasons. Now, the thing I'd like to point out, first of all, is that the race on the second day was a little bit better than the first, which is kind of the opposite of what I expected to happen. I thought with the earlier start on the second day, the track would be warmer and the low grip of the PJ1 as a result of the track being hotter would have been sort of more apparent. And it seems like that wasn't quite the case. Now, I would be curious to see how that track would fare if it was a night race like Texas was previously, because I don't know the whole story behind what makes the PJ1 terrible for IndyCar. Now, first of all, I realize that we have 19 people watching this right or listening to this right now, live on YouTube. I want to point out what PJ1 is in case you don't know what we're on about. So basically, Texas Motor Speedway and a handful of other NASCAR tracks have this compound that they put on the track. I'm sorry, that NASCAR puts on the track, or requests that the tracks put on said track, called PJ1 Track Bite. And it is a compound, a traction compound, that NASCAR has been experimenting with over the past couple of years at select racetracks to try to make the racing better, to try to basically force a second line. You'll notice in some NASCAR races, you'll have drivers running right on the apron, and then some drivers trying to run the middle or the high line. Well, the past couple of years, NASCAR has been saying, okay, well, if drivers aren't running in the middle or high line because there isn't enough grip there to make up for the extra distance that they're going around the track, let's just put a compound down on the track that's going to give them more grip. Unfortunately, what seems to be the case is that that has the opposite effect for IndyCar. And I've seen some drivers saying that it's almost like you're driving on ice when you get up into that compound. We saw Takuma Sato last year crash at Texas by getting up into that in the qualifying session. And over the race, everybody was doing their best to stay out of it. Will Power in the second race, I think it was the second race, got up into it, and you could see even how slow he was going, still was just washing up towards the wall. There just wasn't any grip there. And so my question is, I don't know if you know the answer to this, Kyle, but I'm curious if they ran that race at night, like a decent ways into the night, so the track had a good enough chance to cool down. I know it's Texas and I know it's Central Time, and you're talking about a race that's ending pretty late for the East Coasters at that point. But I'm wondering if they had that race end at like 11 p.m. local, even if that's midnight Eastern Time, how that would have looked in comparison to what we'd seen this weekend with a track that's racing, or with cars that are racing towards sunset or afternoon. Because it's my impression that the reason why the PJ1 has no grip is because it's a very dark compound on the track that absorbs more light than the regular surface. And the offset of that, obviously, when you have a track that's hotter, it's more slick and therefore less grippy. I don't know if you have anything to add on to that, but that was my takeaway as to how the races were actually being affected. I don't know if it's the compound itself, though, that's actually less grippy, but I couldn't imagine that's the case considering its whole purpose is to add grip. So do you have anything to add on to that?
So here's the thing about PJ1 on Texas. I don't think a later start time would have helped. The thing about it is it's not actually PJ1 on the track. So the last time PJ1 was applied was probably last fall for NASCAR. So basically it's just, let's call it a PJ1 stain. Texas has tried, they said they've tried for months, like just different techniques of like scraping it at night, like over and over, try to get the PJ1 off as much as they can. But Graham Rahal actually said something interesting in a press conference after the Sunday race. He said that according to Firestone data, the PJ1 stain was 20 to 25% less grip than the normal surface. Essentially, if it was never reapplied, that it'd eventually go away, and they could have two lanes again, but it'd be a long process. He also said if you went out and stood on the PJ1 or the stain, it's significantly slicker. So it's almost like walking on ice.
Yeah, that's what I heard as well.
So it's like, they're just gonna, like Eddie Gossett said today too, they're gonna have to figure out some technique or way to, bring it up. Eddie Gossett's pretty much already ruled out having a repave, and he said that they're gonna reapply the PJ1 for NASCAR. So if I'm IndyCar right now, and you're gonna keep having these terrible races, you're gonna have this big dark spots on the edges of the track that your cars can't run on. And if you get into it, they're going to wreck and cost the teams, a couple $1 million. Then I'm not going to run there. Like it's just that just makes the most sense. Like if you're going to have a racetrack that's as wide and as fast as Texas, but you're going to limit them to only being able to run the bottom, then I'm not going to do that. I think it's pretty simple.
Yeah, well, a repave is completely out the window because they just repaved that track in
Yeah.
2017. So, or is it 2000? Yeah, 17. Um, but yeah, that's just a hopeless situation. I think.
Hmm.
Um, I would be curious, as I said, to see if moving it tonight would have any effect whatsoever. But yeah, that it looks like the future of that race, which it's a shame because that race used to be kind of a staple excitement race for IndyCar. Well, it depends on what season. I know they had some poor runnings there. 2015 wasn't especially exciting, and that was on the old Texas as well, even before they reconfigured the track. But you look at 2016 was regarded as a great race in terms of the quality of racing. 2017, even after the reconfiguration, but before they put the PJ1 down, was also a pretty exciting race. Granted, they had a completely different aero package there with IndyCar running in
Well,
the
I
aero
think
kit still.
the big one to me that I think was 2019, because 2019 was fantastic. And you have the current Aero kit and current Texas. And it's just like, it's not, because the track configuration, while turn one is bad, the current configuration and the Aero kit can provide good racing in Texas. And I think you saw it on Sunday because I think runs were possible and you could see passing happening, but there was no chance of, being able to do, there was a lot of things you couldn't do because you couldn't get into that second lane. You had to just be so careful, and there's no way of even trying to run a second groove or try anything else. So you're pretty much forced to just run in dirty air the entire time, which just forces you to, lose time to the car in front of you. And it's just like nobody wins in that scenario.
Right. Um, I want to hear your thoughts on this one because Gamwolfer said this is going to sound weird, but could a road course aero kit with high boost work for IndyCar at Texas?
Maybe weird. I always said there are ideas like that. I don't think it'd work at Texas, but I always said, um, I think the racing would be better at short tracks if you went with a different boost or a different aero package. Will Power always said it like, hey, why don't we, especially during the aero kit era, when there wasn't a lot, like they would literally put the speedway wings on the bumpers, and it was just like, there's not a lot, like let's just up the boost like as fast as we can get it and just have us lifting and actually driving. Yeah, I think it'd be more interesting in that perspective. I do think at short tracks it would be interesting to see if we could put, take all of the downforce off of them and up the horsepower and have them, lifting and drive them a little bit harder. I think it'd be a little bit more interesting. But I think that much downforce, even with higher speeds from high boost, maybe if you look at the short oval aero kit, basically the road course aero kit with an element taken off of the front and the rear wing, I think it's maybe, but that might provide more downforce than overall the package of racing that they're trying to get from this, because they're trying to steer away from pack racing while at the same time make it's a fine line. Because I'm kind of I'm in the same boat as IndyCar, where I don't think pack racing is something we should be doing weekly like they were doing in the IRL in the mid 2000s. But I think races like 2015, or that it's just single file the whole time, and nobody can pass. I mean, I think the best way to put it is I'm okay with boring races when it's just obvious that someone's way better, right? When who the fastest car is and they're just taking off. I'm fine with that because the fastest car should win. But when it's like that because there's not an opportunity or a way to actually get around someone and pass because of dirty air or because of different things, then I think it becomes a problem. Like with the modern aero kit, the problem with it is there's just not a lot of adjustment, and of course it's all spec. So it's like when every single team is on max downforce they can possibly put in the car, and it's still not enough. So they're basically all running the same thing. I mean, it does need some tweaks. There are some things to look at, but I think adding that much downforce might go in the opposite direction of what they want too far.
Right. Um, Want to start a discussion in the chat here. If Texas is gone, and that was the final race we see with IndyCar at Texas, what oval would you like to see replacing it? Because I think there's a lot of options out there. IndyCar has lost quite a few ovals over the past couple of seasons, and I know that they recently came out and said, yes, we want to try to get some more ovals on the schedule. Notably, Homestead, Miami was a track that got brought up in that sort of article. But if Texas is gone for good, I sort of look at Atlanta. Could they run at Atlanta? It's a similar track layout to what they had at Texas previously. Is there enough interest in Atlanta for a race? I think Texas is a good market for IndyCar in Texas, and that race certainly has put on some great shows in the past. But I don't know. I think the future of that race, if everything stays the way it is right now, is a little bit in question, and I give it one more year before we see what the outcome of that, or what the future of that race should hold. I will say right now that I don't think that race should be a doubleheader anymore, because I think that there's better tracks you can do a doubleheader race at. But we'll wait and see on that one. Now, it is the month of May now, or 4 days into the month of May. And that means that we're a couple of weeks away from IndyCar being on track at Indianapolis. We have the GP coming up first on May 15th. And then we have qualifying the week after for the Indianapolis 500. And then we have the Indianapolis 500 itself back on the traditional Memorial Day date. Now, Kyle, this is going to come as a surprise to you because I didn't get to tell you this before the episode, but your tickets, my tickets that are now your tickets, have officially shipped. So there you go. I feel like Ellen DeGeneres or something right now, giving stuff away. giving stuff away. Yeah. Oprah. There you go. But yeah, I'm not giving them to you. You're paying me. But yeah, so a couple things that I do want to talk about, because Texas, as mentioned in the chat earlier, was possibly a preview of what we can expect to see at Indianapolis in a couple of weeks. Chevy, as you mentioned, seems a little bit better on fuel mileage, which is interesting because I think Honda was traditionally a little bit better with the mileage at the super speedway races. Now, granted, this isn't a tenfold example of what we're going to see at Indianapolis. It's a different track entirely, but Chevy at Texas seemed to be a little bit better with fuel mileage. Also, Arrow McLaren looks extremely strong, not only at Texas, but this season in general. Last season, they were a little bit disappointing at Indianapolis. I think with Fernando Alonso being there were a lot of eyes on that team. And after his crash, he seemed to sort of be a mid-pack car at best. And O'Ward and Askew last year were also sort of in similar boats. I wouldn't call them front runners at all. So I certainly would be interested to see where they fare over the practice days and later qualifying in the race. But after Texas, is there anything else that you're looking at going into Indianapolis in a couple of weeks?
Yeah, that's one thing I thought was a little bit interesting was when you look at where Arrow McLaren was at the Speedway last year, and we come to Texas and Pato O'Ward looks like the dominant car. You look at Pato O'Ward, someone who was bumped from the 2019 Indy 500 and really doesn't have that huge of an oval background. looking at him as one of the favorites coming into this month. Honestly, Arrow McLaren has not. They've shown pace at every single race we've gone to this year. Just, I mean, I think we should expect that at every race this season. We saw the same thing last year where it just seemed like Pata was always up front no matter what. I expect them to win a few more races this year, and I expect Pato to be in contention for the championship big time. So, I mean, coming this month, I definitely look at Pato. I definitely wouldn't rule out Scott Dixon. Second place last year. He looked really good. But once again at the Ovals, Rahal Letterman Lanigan, Graham Rahal, I think he passed the most cars last weekend, period, out of anyone. Finished third last year. They did lose Eddie Jones over the offseason. Eddie Jones retired, which is a longtime engineer for that team, and worked with Sato for a few years. But they definitely look like they haven't lost speed. It looks like they've lost qualifying speed this year, which is interesting in the road courses. But yeah, I mean, I expect Sato, Rahal, and Ferrucci to be strong contenders all month. I mean, think about it. You have first, third, and fourth in the finishing order on the same team this year. So I think they have a really good lineup. I should expect them to be strong. A couple things to note is, McLaughlin, first oval, finishing second. Roger Penske, I've said it on the podcast, said that McLaughlin was the next Rick Mears, and it's to see him second, first oval race, and look that comfortable. And like you said, with his confidence, I mean, he's definitely someone I'm going to look at all month closely to see how he does at the Speedway. He's had a bunch of testing there. And I mean, overall, last year we saw the Penske cars didn't have a lot of pace. And Honda looked like they were very dominant. And so with a Chevy and a Honda winning the Texas races, I mean, it's going to be close, and it's as unpredictable as ever. I'm pretty excited.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about all of that over the next couple of weeks. Kyle's going to be in Indianapolis for quite a bit of this month.
For the first time.
Yeah,
first time doing it. Yeah,
stick around, and we're going to be talking about a lot of that over the next couple of months. Final race I want to recap from this weekend is Formula One. Now, Kyle, I'm going to go off on a limb and say you didn't watch this race, but
I didn't need to.
Your prediction on who the top three finishers were.
Was it Hamilton, Verstappen, and Bottas?
Yes, it was. I think that was the 15th time that those three were on the podium. I think that's the most common F1 podium in history now, overtaking Hamilton, Rosberg, and Vettel. But a couple of things to talk about from that race still. It is still the battle between Hamilton and Verstappen. This entire season looks like it's here to stay. Mercedes actually had a little bit of an advantage at Portimao. Now, that track, notably this weekend, was very windy, and it seemed sort of the opposite of what we were expecting, where the Honda Red Bull was a little bit faster on the straight line sections, and the Mercedes was maybe a little bit better around the turns. Now, Verstappen put up a lap in qualifying, a Q3 that would have been good enough for pole. Unfortunately, was deleted for going off track. In the race, it was Valtteri Bottas actually that was on pole, and Lewis Hamilton starting second, Max Verstappen third. Max Verstappen got by Hamilton right at the start of the race. Hamilton was third. Bottas held on to the lead. And then basically from there, Hamilton started picking up some pace. It looked like maybe Verstappen was going to be able to fight for the lead. But then Hamilton sort of came from nowhere. Not really from nowhere, but he came from behind and was able to pass both of them. And Valtteri Bottas actually ended up getting passed by Verstappen as well, so he finished third. Now, the point standings right now are still very close, only 8 points separating Hamilton and Verstappen. Lando Norris is still holding on to third in points after that race. Still anybody's game, though, right now, and we're going into Spain this weekend for another race, which we're going to be recapping next week, hopefully.
Did they already make the improvements to Spain, to the? You never have to get rid of that
I do
weird.
remember. Yeah. I believe they did,
If they did, I'm excited.
but I'm not sure actually. I can't tell you that out of certainty, but I believe they did make the adjustment. I don't remember what turn would that have been. That would have been turn number
If I remembered
13.
what turn it was, I would have told
Oh
you.
no, I'm sorry. I'm looking at Algarve still.
I mean, you know which corner it is I'm talking about, the one with
I do.
the
Yes.
red, big red Circuit de la Barcelona on it that used to be the dumb like left. Now it's just like they turn it into the sweeper, what it's supposed to be.
I believe they did make that change. Yeah, turn 10.
Because they made
Because
that
it's showing up
permanent,
on the
which
official
is
track
great.
map as that. Yeah, turn 10 has been reprofiled. So there you go.
Now they just
Um,
got to get rid of the stupid last sector chicane, and it'll be perfect.
yeah, well, that was there for motorbike racing originally, wasn't it?
I think so.
Anyway, yeah, I'll put my grudges with Catalunya aside for now. But obviously, it's still kind of anybody's game going into that weekend. I can't make an honest prediction as to whether I think Hamilton or Verstappen is going to be quicker. After Spain, though, we have Monaco, which is a week before the Indianapolis 500 this year, so it's falling on the same weekend as Indy 500 qualifying. Um, I believe, yeah, that is the next race after Spain. Oh, yes, okay. I just wanted to make sure. Um, so yeah, we're gonna keep our eyes closely on that battle between Hamilton and Verstappen, see who's gonna come out on top at the end of the season. Uh, in seasons past, it looks like anytime a driver can pull an advantage. I know Sebastian Vettel looked like a strong championship contender in the past. It seems like if you lose that momentum mid-season, that's where Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes are really able to capitalize. So I'm keeping my eyes very closely, paid attention to that fight right there for the top spot in the championship, and see who's going to come out on top at season's end. But we're still only 3 races in right now, so it's anybody's game. And I think that's all we're going to have for race recaps this weekend, unless you had anything to add on, Kyle. But I do want to hop into the news section because we're 57 minutes into this episode and haven't even touched on an ounce of the occupied amount of news stories that we have
Yeah,
to
we
go
only
over
had a
here.
little bit of news.
Yeah, only a little
None
bit.
of it's a big deal at all.
I'm going to start with the first one right here, which is hopping back to sports car racing, that Penske officially came out today as the team that is going to be working alongside Porsche for their LMDh effort. Now, me personally, that doesn't come as a surprise. I think a lot of people were expecting Penske to team up with Porsche after their departure with Acura. Now, that will be coming in 2023. And actually, I think Porsche said they want to have that car roll out sometime in 2021, which is quite an early rollout. I mean, even Toyota with their new Hypercar didn't have a rollout until, I believe, the end of last year is when they finally started getting some on-track testing with that car. But Penske back with Porsche for the first time since 2008, back then with the glorious RS Spiders, the DHL liveried cars that I adored so much. If there's one thing I could hope for is that DHL would come back and we get some yellow Porsche LMDh cars, but I can keep dreaming on that one. We'll have to see. But yeah, that's just another manufacturer to add onto the stable there. Obviously, Porsche's already been confirmed, but having Penske in the prototype stable once again is fantastic. And for the first time, Roger Penske's team will actually be contesting for the win at the Le Mans 24 Hours, which I think is fantastic. The captain, highly successful at Indianapolis, but hasn't been able to give a crack at Le Mans yet. So I'd love to see what they're able to do with that program. There were 2 other teams in consideration for that seat. I think there were 2 other teams that were front runners. One of them was, I believe, Manthey Racing. I'm trying to see if I can pull up the other teams that were front runners. I know one was Manthey, and I couldn't remember the other one off the top of my head. But Kyle, if you want to give some 2 cents here, I can see if I can find that.
I don't have.
You don't have. You don't. It's not even 2 cents. It's a.
Do you? My
Five
brain
cents,
went to
isn't it?
another
It
different
was
place while
United
you were
Autosports.
speaking.
There you go. United
While you were
Autosports.
speaking, I went to a totally different place. You want to hear some news, Chris?
What's
Want to
up?
hear some news? Scott Tucker was freed from his 1.3 billion in debt.
Was he?
Yeah,
Is he still in prison?
I don't know.
Oh, okay.
He doesn't have that debt. Yeah, that's where I
It
went.
doesn't matter if you're spending life in prison, but
It's only 16 years, Chris.
it's only 16.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah, 16 years and 3 months.
Just reading through some of the comments here. A couple of people talking about GM and LMDh. That's something that I think we're going to hear something about in the next month or so. Whether GM is going to be going with Cadillac or Corvette or nobody at all.
I bet it's Caddy.
Cadillac, yeah. I don't know. That's still an ever-changing situation.
It seems like Corvette going to GT Pro just comes more and more like a thing that's happening. And IMSA is going to give them a waiver for the first year until they can build a GT3. I feel like that's what's happening.
We got another comment here. VW's partner LMP2 chassis is going to be a Porsche LMDh before it's even an LMP2. So the latest I've heard is that Porsche and Audi are both looking towards Multimatic for the LMP2 chassis that serves as the backbone for both of their cars. If you look at the Multimatic LMP2 car, in the current DPi era, hasn't been very successful. If you don't look beyond Mazda, who has been able to pull some wins with that chassis. That car, just as the spec LMP2 car, though, was rather terrible and only contested in a handful of races where it had really no standout notable events apart from the 2017 Rolex 24 where they got a podium. But apart from that, I'm not really too sure where you're going with that one. But do inform me because I'm kind of curious. Imagine Montoya coming back with Penske for Le Mans Triple Crown time. That's where a lot of people's eyes have been going for, I think. Juan Pablo Montoya is getting up there a little bit in age, but he's certainly still showing that he's capable of driving a prototype. He's rather faring well, even at Spa. Doing quite well. Of course, Ben Keating ran into a little bit of frustration with Juan Pablo Montoya over the Spa weekend this past weekend, but still very capable in the hands of, still a very capable driver to pilot a prototype. I think a lot of people have been speculating that, I'm sure Montoya would love to give it a shot, but he's going to be nearing about 50 years old by the time that car comes around. So we're going to have to see if Roger gives him the okay for that one. Yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say on that note. There was another thing that I wanted to talk about coming out of Daily Sports Car. I believe it was Graham Goodwin. I just want to credit this correctly here. I do know it was with Daily Sports Car, speculating some more prospects for LMDh and Hypercar for the future that haven't committed yet. One of them being Alpine, who obviously is competing in Hypercar this year with an LMP1 grandfathered car. That's raised a lot of questions in the past, notably that the LMP1 cars are only going to be eligible for this season. So is Alpine going to continue after this season with their own car that's built from the ground up, or are they going to call it quits entirely after this season? Unfortunately, the article isn't loading for me, but I can tell you that the other one in talks with LMDh was BMW. And BMW has been a name that's kind of been all over the place a little bit recently. At first, they weren't interested in LMDh. They wanted to focus on some hydrogen stuff. And now it's looking like they potentially might be interested in LMDh again. So that's also a name that we need to keep an eye on. I believe the article said they're closer to a formal evaluation than Alpine was. So keep your eyes peeled for something from BMW potentially in the next month or two. See a lot of chat messages coming up about Ford in LMDh. That's another name that's been going around quite a bit ever since the departure of the GT program in 2019. That has been something that a lot of people have wanted to see, I think. and a name that's been tossed around a little bit as well. So I'm still waiting to see if we're going to get any more definitive rumors when it comes to that program, but I haven't heard anything at the moment. Alberto Sanchez saying, speaking of Corvette/GM, personally, they're probably going to do a GT3 Corvette for IMSA only, knowing how the Cadillac, ATS-VR, and Pirelli World Challenge went. They aren't going to build cars for customers. So this is an issue I've talked about in previous episodes, and it is namely that GT3, at the end of the day, is a customer-based formula. When you look at GTE, it is primarily designed for the opposite. It's designed for factory programs. They're more expensive than GT3 cars. The programs are more costly to run. And so that's where you have, you look at some teams like AF Corsa with the Ferrari program, Pratt & Miller with Corvette, Chip Ganassi and Ford Performance with the Ford GT program, Porsche, they have their own factory GT programs with the 911 GTE car. Unfortunately, they lost the IMSA one last season, but that's a whole other thing. So Corvette trying to do a GT3 car that is not a proper GT3 program, meaning they don't have, I think the number is 25 cars available to customers, is something that's still raising some question marks, because Corvette, last I've heard, is looking to adapt their GTE car to the GT3 regulations because Pratt & Miller is unable to fulfill those 25 customer cars. That is a requirement for GT3 cars. Obviously, they would need a waiver for something like that, which is something that we have talked about in some previous episodes. But yeah, GM has always been a little bit picky when it comes to customer cars and sports car racing. And I don't see that changing, especially with the Corvette program, where they've been rather strict in the past, i.e. not letting Callaway run their GT3 C7 car in IMSA GTD in the past. So that's just where I think that's going to be headed.
You know, it would have been funny. So
What's
we're
that?
already talking about P2 cars being the same pace as hypercars. Imagine if they would have just let Corvette stay in GTE by themselves. We could have had Corvette in their own class again. Could have gone back to 2008, like full on.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's something. Kyle and I were just watching some 2008 ALMS races a couple of weeks ago now, in between the last episode and now, and that was something that's worth noting. GT1 when Corvette was kind of in a class by themselves, literally. So yeah, actually that's another thing that we can talk about is people have been saying, all right, actually when I say people, I mean you, Kyle, with the LMP2 cars and the hypercars seeming so closely matched at Spa for the World Endurance Championship, does that now mean that the DPi cars are the fastest prototypes in racing?
I didn't say that.
And sort of a footnote to that, does that mean that the LMDh cars are going to be faster than the Le Mans hypercars?
It definitely makes me more, definitely gives me more confidence that the LMDhs are going to be able to be brought up to speed to the hypercars.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is
That was
where
one thing I was a little concerned with, especially when they go to Le Mans, that the ACO would just give the hypercars all the beans, and LMDh should be kind of screwed because it's not their regulation, really.
Right. This sort of ties back to where I was saying I hope they find a way to speed up the hypercars rather than slow down the other classes, because at the end of the day, I think everybody wants to see cars that are running faster, not cars that are running slower than they were before. Unfortunately, when it comes to LMP1 and Le Mans Hypercar, that's completely out the window, but nobody really wants to see the LMP2 cars being slowed down any more than they already have been. Now I'm seeing some talk about BMW being thrown around. To be fair, BMW is kind of different because they liked to use different platforms for each category. I think that's in reference to their GT3 programs that's being discussed right now. So yeah, I think that may cover that for the this sort of sidetracked a little bit, but it was about the Penske LMDh news that came out today with Porsche. Actually, one more thing still on about that is that there is a footnote here saying that customer cars are still a potential for happening, despite Penske being the official team partner for the LMDh program. And I guess something else to talk about while we're on this note is Audi recently came out with something saying that their vision for their new LMDh car is to make it similar to what the R8 was, where you have one team that's running sort of the factory program, being Yost, and then they had a decent amount of teams running customer cars. So it seems like Audi in particular is really looking for a customer, a good amount of customer teams to run that LMDh program as well alongside the factory team. So that's something that's going to be really interesting and I think fantastic to see, because anytime a manufacturer is encouraging customer entries, it just means that more entries are likely to be on the grid. So I'm really excited for that. Both of those cars are expected to debut in 2023, likely at the Rolex 24.
Is the BMW is the Audi factory team going to be used? Let's be honest.
Yeah, that's another thing that's been coming up now. You know, we can have a repeat of 2008 completely if we go back and do that.
Also, Gam Wolfers and Scrim said that Gam asked, isn't LMP2 going to a new generation of regulations, or did that already happen? And then Scrim said the LMDh aren't going to be based on current gen LMP2, they're based on next gen, which will probably be slower. So yeah, LMP2 does have a new regulation coming, which it probably will be slower, to be like a bit slower than the hypercars. But with LMDh, the cars will be based on the LMP2 chassis. They will have their own engines, and while spec, they will have hybrid systems, and I expect them to be much faster than. They're obviously going to be much faster than current day DPi, and DPi is pretty fast. And I would say that the next gen LMP2 is going to be much slower, but I say that doesn't mean that LMDh is going to be, as slow. I don't think they're going to be slower than current DPi. I think current DPi is already pretty fast. They'd probably give a run for their money at this point.
Yeah, again, fingers still crossed that we have proper balancing between the LMDh and Le Mans Hypercars in 2023, because I will remain skeptical about it until I see them on track, but I think we've been promised way too many things in the past and then sort of gotten let down. So my fingers will remain crossed for the next 2 years until we hopefully get an answer to that finally. But until then, it's all just anticipation on my end. Now, we want to move on to some IndyCar news, because there actually has been a little bit coming out. I want to start real quick here, and then you can sort of hop on with it. That the sixth Andretti car was confirmed for the Indianapolis 500 today. Its driver was confirmed, I should say, being Stefan Wilson, returning to Andretti and the Indianapolis 500 for the first time since 2018, where he was only a couple laps shy of winning before having to pit for fuel. So Kyle, being the resident IndyCar guy here, why don't you give us some more information about that little tidbit of news that came out today as well?
Yeah, it's one that I really wanted Steph Wilson to get the seat, but it wasn't the one I would say I would have expected to get it. The car will be funded by Lola Sport, which is trying to find what it is. And some other, I don't know. There's a lot of companies and people put into this entry. And I'm really glad that Steph Wilson was able to get the deal done. And I'm pretty happy that it was Steph Wilson that got it. Heard it was going to be Servia. Could have been Askew. But yeah, Steph Wilson, a guy who led laps in his last start with Andretti, actually, in the 500 in 2018. Yeah, I'm pretty excited for him to get another shot.
Lola Sport, to answer your question, is a ladies golf fashion/lifestyle brand.
Yeah. I knew it was like ladies, like clothes. Ladies golf clothes. Awesome.
So do we have anything else to add on to that? Add on to that entry? I mean, I'm certainly equally as excited as you. I think Stefan Wilson is a driver who has been really fighting for a seat over the past couple of seasons. If you go on his Twitter, you'll see that every time around this time, a little bit earlier, he is actively trying to see if he can pull in some funding for a seat at the Indianapolis 500. And when it comes to Indy, there's not that much of a better seat than you can find than with Andretti Autosports. So I'm certainly really excited for him, hoping that he's going to be able to find some good results and some good pace over the next couple of weeks, or next few weeks, I should say. But I believe that's all we have to say on that one. Now, anything else that we have coming out of the world of IndyCar? Because it's been 2 weeks since we've had an episode. That was a question for you here.
Will Power got another contract from Penske. Should be there until 2023.
2023. He was actually.
Really,
it's funny how like every single time we think a driver's on the chopping block for Penske, and then they start putting down some good results, and then they get a contract extension. Because Simon Pagenaud was the same way in 2019 when, before he put in that Indy 500 win, and Juan Pablo Montoya as well was unfortunately he didn't really get that extension at the end of 2016, but that was another driver as well that I think was being talked about in terms of his future at Penske. So I think Will Power is the most recent one that's been discussed, and for him to get a contract extension means that is anybody's contract up with Penske at the end of the season then? That's sort of a question to put you on the spot, but
what was what?
Is anybody's contract at Penske up at this end of this season?
Might be Pagenaud. Maybe Pagenaud.
Okay.
But I knew Power was one for sure. I think Pagenaud might be on a contract here.
Okay. So yeah, I don't really have anything that much to add on to that. Although I am a little bit surprised that it came this early. Usually we see those contract extensions come a little bit later in the season, I think. And you know what? I don't think there's that much more to discuss.
We got my happiest news of the day.
Oh, what's that?
Robert Wickens returned to a car today.
Oh, sure. There you go.
Ryan Hurd Autosport in the touring car GT4 at Mid-Ohio. He's about 15 minutes from my house. I woke up and I saw that. I was like, I wanted to go drive to Mid-Ohio so bad.
What stopped you?
Mainly going to work.
That
drive by Mid-Ohio. Robert Wickens for life. I wore my Wickens shirt today. I was pretty pumped. That definitely got me out of bed this morning. I was pretty happy to see that. He was driving with the hand controls because Michael Johnson also drives with hand controls in the touring car class. So they already had the system set up, and Wickens came back and tested today at Mid-Ohio. I don't know what races he might be doing. I don't know what the whole plan is, but yeah, he was back in a race car driving today. And it made me happy. And what's ironic, I was literally like 2 days ago, I thought to myself, I was like, what's Robert Wickens up to? And I just started looking at his Instagram and I started watching. He did this like YouTube series called Brick by Brick, where he did like an episode of like a whole like 20-minute video on his racing simulator, and then a whole 20-minute video on like his daily training that he uploaded like 2 months ago that I missed. So I spent like an hour just like seeing what Wickens has been up to lately, because before today he hadn't posted anything in like a month. So I just had a random like, what's Wickens up to? And 2 days later, here we are. He's back in a freaking car. Ah, that's so cool. Favorite news of the day right there.
And I guess last thing here, since it was brought up in the chat, is that Jimmy Johnson will be a part of the Indy 500 pre-race broadcast team. I think he took the role that Danica Patrick had last season.
Danica's going to be there.
Oh, she is. Okay.
It's going to be Danica, Jimmy, and Tirico.
Mike Tirico. Okay. All that on NBC in a couple of weeks' time. Because I forgot the date. Let's pull up the calendar. The Indy 500 should be on May 30th.
Over under on Jimmy getting on the broadcast and dropping that he that he's going to test at the Oval.
I don't think it's that likely, but
Mm.
but
I think his wife's going to warm up to it. I think it's going to happen.
well, we'll have to wait and see on that one. This is the trend with everything on this podcast, it seems. And then Cam Wolfers also said, speaking of broadcast, word is CBS wants to get the IndyCar TV rights. Yeah, I do want to discuss that, but I'm not going to do it in this episode. I'm going to see if we can wait maybe an episode or two, get a little bit more information, because that has been a talking point as of recent. And certainly there is a lot to sort of debrief there. But this episode, we've already had quite a bit to talk about. So stay tuned to some future episodes where we'll hopefully, if we got a slow news week, we can probably try to talk about that a little bit. Also here, before the episode's up, I do want to give just a couple of words because we lost some rather notable drivers this week in racing. So I just want to say Eric McClure and Bobby Unser were two of the drivers that we had lost this week. Obviously a very sad situation, both a little bit unexpected, so just condolences to the families of both of those drivers. Certainly was a little bit of a burden going into this otherwise exciting month of racing, and wish the best to both of their families. But anyways, I think that's going to be a wrap on this episode. Try to go over quite as much as we could, so there's potentially some things that we missed over this entire episode. But we'll be back next week. Hopefully we don't have quite as much to talk about, because it is a lot to unpack in a slightly limited time frame. But as always, I'm going to do the post-episode spiel, where you can find us on podcasting platforms anywhere. I'm going to say tomorrow, but it's always like 2 days at this point on podcasting platforms anywhere. So that's Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can just search for the Rain Race Podcast and it should show up there. And that's a little bit of a better listening format if you're driving to work or listening to us on a run or something like that, than paying attention to the YouTube video, which uses up more bandwidth and all that stuff. As I said before, it's the month of May, which means that we're going to have a lot of discussion over the next couple of weeks, primarily IndyCar based. So if you're into that sort of stuff, you can subscribe to the channel. We're going to be talking about that a lot on the podcast. And I'm also going to try to get out an IndyCar video on my channel, just a proper video. So if you have any suggestions for that, shoot me a message in the comments or go on my Discord. Let me know some ideas for that. Again, I'm going to plug the Discord. If you go to my channel, it is the, I think, second link in the banner will show you an invite to my Discord. You can follow myself and Kyle on Twitter. Links to those will be in the description. Follow the Rain Race Podcast on Twitter. And I think that's all we have for this episode. So thank you all so much for tuning in. It's been a great episode. A lot of new faces here this time. Thank you all so much for tuning in. And we hope to see you next week for another episode of the Rain Race Podcast. Take care.